Today, I'm delighted to welcome Annie Dean, who leads the Team Anywhere initiative at Atlassian, to the Digital HR Leaders podcast. Hi, Annie. Welcome to the show. To kick things off, could you start by telling us a little bit about yourself, your background, your role, and Team Anywhere, perhaps, and its context at Atlassian?
Thank you so much for having me, David. So I would love to kick off by talking about my sort of non-traditional role and non-traditional pathway to getting there. Today, I am the head of Team Anywhere at Atlassian, which is a software company that you may know for products like Jira, Confluence, Loom. Basically, we help teams collaborate wherever they are working from. And in my role as the head of Team Anywhere, I'm really responsible for helping the company continue to excel as a distributed company. So in 2020, like many other companies, our founders announced an intent to become distributed first. And that means that while we do have 12 global offices, folks are not required to attend them. And yet they do, which we can talk more about throughout this conversation. And I oversee a non-traditional org that includes our real estate and offices. So I'm the head of real estate, as well as a research team known as the Teamwork Lab, run by behavioral scientists that study how work happens today. And I also oversee a set of talent programs, including the Team Anywhere policy, which sets forth the idea that we are a distributed company, as well as some important talent programs like onboarding and what we call intentional togetherness, another key program that we can talk about throughout our conversation. And when I think about, when I look back in terms of how I got to this role, it's been a pretty non-traditional path that's really been informed by what I'm interested in and curious about. I started my career as a corporate real estate attorney on Wall Street. So think about representing lenders in institutional lenders in mega deals of hotel portfolios or whatever, lending to whatever Blackstone is buying type of thing. And then because I had a very challenging experience as a young mother early in my career as an attorney, I really was curious about how to make work better. It just seemed like it didn't make sense to me that I would be at the office at 4:00 in the morning and then, miss the hours that my son was awake during the day. I felt like there could be a different and more effective way of working that ultimately would solve some of the challenges that I was seeing play out in my workplace, like the fact that there were no women partners. And that led me to found a startup, which was a people analytics platform to help the Fortune 500 wrestle with the opportunity of the flexible workplace. And that was all pre-pandemic. So that was the time period from about 2016 to 2020. And the company was actually acquired in January 2020, at which point I thought, you know what, I've done my work. I can see that this is the future, but CEOs are not fully aligned with it. I'm tired of banging my head against the wall. I'm going to go, I decided to go to Deloitte, to their workforce transformation org within human capital. And I thought, I'll put 10% of time into this kind of flexibility concept. And of course, I joined Deloitte on February 24th, 2020. And very quickly, I was a leading point person to help the Fortune 500 adopt the mandatory work from home orders that were unfolding at the time as the crisis of the pandemic was developing. And you have to remember that in 2019, CIOs did not have Zoom as a default in their calendar invites. So, as organizations, we just weren't really there yet. And after about a year of working with Deloitte on these, on setting up new models of working for large corporations, I then became the first head of remote at Facebook, where we sort of designed the set of talent policies that would really define that era. And after about a year and a half there, I came over to Atlassian, where I had this really cool opportunity to design a much larger organization. And also, it's been very exciting to do this work at a company where the business is really oriented towards succeeding at distributed, because it is our business to help teams work on the internet. And that's what this world looks like. Distributed work is this non-controversial idea that work happens on the internet. And Atlassian really is at the forefront of that. So being here has been an amazing laboratory to play with these ideas.
No, I mean that's a great introduction and really helpful, I think, for our listeners, Annie, in the context. And I think sometimes we have to, realize that people were working remotely before the pandemic, despite what some headlines might suggest. And really interesting that obviously so much so that you were actually able to set up a company to support companies with that process, prior to the pandemic starting. I won't talk about the timing of the acquisition, but I'm sure there are moments where you wish it had been a few months later. But
exactly. Although it was 2020 was not a great time to be an entrepreneur, so I'm happy that I didn't have the responsibility of managing that.
That is very true. And just for context, most of the people that listen to this podcast are based in HR. Are you in HR, or do you work tangential and close partnership with HR?
It's a great question. And as I've done this work, I've been in different parts of organizations, both as an advisor and as an employee. So, when I was working at Deloitte, sometimes it would be advising the HR team, sometimes it would be advising the CIO org. When I was at Facebook, I reported through the chief people officer. When I joined Atlassian, I was hired by the COO and reported to the COO, and then eventually shifted into reporting through the chief people officer. What's interesting about my remit is that although I do report through the chief people officer today, we have a really close partnership, and our work often sits outside of what would traditionally be in a people remit. We have a lot of close partnership with our product teams, our sales teams, and our marketing teams. And there's a lot of support and space created to make that happen.
And is there an element of what you and your team doing, which is like customer zero, effectively? You're trying out products for Atlassian before you potentially roll those out to customers?
Exactly. In our teamwork lab, we really focus on this concept of Atlassian on Atlassian. And what we sort of did as we were developing our thesis about how modern work unfolds for everyone is we really looked at these kind of magical pockets of Atlassian where, in particular, asynchronous work was really flourishing in ways that felt very new. And we have a experiment sort of process by which we recruit, 5,000 Atlassians have participated in our experiments, and we sort of A/B test, what we have decided is kind of an ideal way of doing a workflow versus, a control way. And it helps us understand and gain validation that it's worth it to drive the change towards the quote unquote better workflow, or to test new workflow ideas. And so not only is this all rooted in what we learn at Atlassian, but it's also tested at scale within Atlassian, which, means that there's a lot of experimentation happening. It doesn't always mean that everything we're recommending externally is perfectly adopted within Atlassian, but that there is this really rich testing ground that we are playing with as a laboratory.
Yeah, and maybe when we talk about some of the learnings, I think for listeners later, that A/B testing, we need to do more of that in HR, particularly with topics such as, ways of working and everything else, I think. So you mentioned...
It's interesting though, David, before you move on from that, I was having a conversation with customers not long ago, and we went around the room. It was about 20 large enterprise customers, and every single leader indicated that their organization was going through a significant transformation. A lot of it due to, AI being an opportunity to transform various business models. But every leader also said that they were struggling with how to drive experimentation and change how work happens. And yet, across the board, there was no owner for that work. So I do think that's an opportunity for HR organizations to really establish leadership about driving the operational efficacy of working differently, which I do think is kind of the opportunity of our time with the advent of AI. AI not only gives us new opportunities as we pursue new business models, but it also gives us a true transformational opportunity in how work gets done. And I do think that's kind of where the next level of effectiveness in our, corporations can come from.
I think you're right, and I think we'll talk about that. I
Yeah.
think in our conversation, and yes, that experimentation again for listeners that are looking to find out more about that. Definitely recommend checking out Linda Grattan's column on MIT Sloan Management Review. She's written about that on a number of occasions in relation to hybrid work, and a couple of um, article she's had released in Harvard Business Review on that topic as well. But let's turn to Atlassian, Annie. So you mentioned that Atlassian adopted a fully distributed workforce model back in 2020.
Right.
How has that journey evolved over the past 5 years?
It's a great question. I think one of the things that is most interesting about Atlassian's journey is the very strong executive sponsorship we've had for this model. So, what struck me when I first arrived at Atlassian, and I was so used to having conversations with people in all kinds of companies all over the market who were really struggling to grapple with core ideas about what it means to be a distributed company. And when I got to Atlassian, it was clear that Mike and Scott, our co founders, were among the most sophisticated people thinking about this topic. And I think that sophistication has led clarity in their thinking and given us a strong platform to continue to experiment over this, 5-year period. And remember also that the rubber doesn't hit the road on this stuff until offices reopen, right? So we all kind of get this 2-year period where we're trying to figure it out and experiment, but then once you get the offices back in play, there's a lot more pressure to start to figure out how an organization needs to be designed differently to thrive in this distributed world. So, on the one hand, and when I got to Atlassian, by the way, there had been this great cross-functional team, basically of volunteers, that decided many of the key elements of what this policy would look like. And so I was able to arrive with really clear thinking already on the table that I just needed to operationalize and kind of push forward in other ways. And I felt like the decisions that had been made were so spot on. But one of the things that we did to make sure that this program would have longevity is we really spent time getting data on what was happening at the company. How was this policy impacting things like our ability to hire? How was it, was it having a negative impact on performance in any way? Was it, did we have evidence that innovation was still thriving? And by taking a research-based lens to this, it gave us the clarity to say, this is something we want to continue to lean into. Because when we looked at those success metrics, we found that we were getting double the number of job applicants, that our roles were getting filled 20% faster. At any of our performance research studies showed that there was no negative impact that we could identify related to individual performance or team performance. We studied innovation and found that distributed teams were among our most innovative and effective teams by a number of different measures. And so by having this data, it gave us the opportunity to have a very sensible conversation that enabled us to say, instead of relitigating this concept, let's instead focus on what's different about how shit gets done, at an organization today that requires us to change the design of our offices. How do we, get more budget to support what we call intentional togetherness gatherings, which is the opportunity for people to come together on site for a couple of days per quarter. Those become substantial operational questions, but they are questions that are driven by a clear sense of what needs to happen and a good set of guardrails about what value those types of investments or operational changes will make. And that just is a totally different kind of conversation than having a circular discussion about, trying to bring value to offices by having people attend them without addressing what challenges the organization is truly facing, which is one of the sort of catch-22s that I see continue to dominate our conversations about this topic today.
And I guess as you move to a distributed model, whether it's a fully distributed model or a partially distributed model, you're learning all the time. It's probably more complex than having either a fully remote organization or a fully on-site organization. The way you manage teams is different, perhaps. As you said, when people are together in the office, you need to think intentionally about how you're going to use that time effectively. You need to, and again, we're going to talk about some, what you've learned in those 5 years, some of the biggest lessons. I think you've talked about executive sponsorship. You've talked about experimentation. You've talked about good business questions, so thinking around innovation, what the impact is on hiring, positive or negative. You've talked about using data to ground the conversations. What are some of the other, now you're 5 years into it as an organization, what are some of the other big lessons that you've learned about making a distributed workforce model successful?
I love that question because so much of this work, David, is about transformation in business. And so I think, some of the things that you just mentioned that I've talked about are really business transformation questions, and how to build influence and how to continue to have sponsorship for the decisions that you're making, how to make sure that experimentation drives a design of this program as opposed to just winging it. And yet then there's actually the how do you really do this and what is it that we're doing? And it takes time, by the way, to figure out how to tell that story, because any story of change has to be a really simple story in order for people to get it. And people like Christine on my comms team and Liz, who leads our storytelling efforts, have been instrumental in taking the clarity that we've slowly gotten to and making it into a few set of simple messages. So let me tell you what I think this is that we're doing, and kind of why I think that actually it's an easier model to react to what you just said. You said this must be harder than doing hybrid or fully remote. I actually think this is an easier model. So first of all, a lot of the discussion about these ways of working has been quote unquote about remote work. And that is a term that is a where to work conversation, right? Remote means there's a home office and somebody is not working there. And I think we need to break that whole frame. Distributed work just means that work happens on the internet. It's non-controversial that most kind of work transactions happen in the confines of our computer screens. And that's a really good thing, because AI is the most transformative tool we've ever encountered related to how we work since we basically invented mass production back in, the late 1880s. And AI does not know what's happening at the water cooler. It needs to know what's happening inside your computer. So it behooves companies to make sure that information is in the digital ecosystem to power the assistance of AI. Okay, so that's one thing. Distributed work, it's work that happens on the internet. The second thing is that the conversation has really been dominated about where we work, but it's how we work that matters. And so when you start to work in a way that is digital first, which means that you have fewer better meetings because you value the time you spend together more, you make it possible for people to retrieve the information they need to get their job done from AI on their computer instantly instead of having to wait for a meeting. You make sure your team has a lot of clarity about what their goals are, and you make goals visible to everyone. These are the ways that we need to work differently. And evidence about how work is happening shows us that these are the real problems. 65% of knowledge workers in our State of Teams report said that they think it's more important to respond to a notification than to make progress on their goals. 98% of Fortune 500 leaders, executives, said that their teams could be just as productive in half the time if they could collaborate differently. So those problem spaces are not solved by working in an office. They are solved by working differently. And once you figure out how to work differently, using the digital ecosystem as the way to manage information and get work done, then offices are still important, right? They're a great place to go. They communicate the value of your company. They bring people into an incredible community. They make it really easy for people to get shit done. But they are not how work is orchestrated. They're not how teams are designed. And when you kind of free yourself from the office as the design of work, then things start to get a lot easier and more interesting. And that's where I think, that's why I think it's easier. These are the challenges that we need to make to meet the moment of AI. And it just so happens that as we make those changes, where we work matters less. And by the way, that's a huge advantage to people who, for the past 5 years, have reintegrated a lot of different values, being healthy, being connected to their families. Certainly, this is the highest representation of women in the workforce that we've seen because it gives them the opportunity to balance their caregiving needs. So this is a positive thing for business and a positive thing for people.
So as you said, and I've heard other people who I respect in this space say, more focus on the how, less focus on the where.
Absolutely.
And as you said, the how means work is done differently from how it was done in the past.
Right.
Yeah, very good.
It's funny too, David, because like I mentioned, I oversee our onboarding program. And so we're going through an onboarding transformation right now where we're thinking about different formats of content and different types of content and what type of story that we're telling. And one of the things that we see new hires struggle with at Atlassian is that we genuinely do work differently and it can be uncomfortable. I'll never forget that when I first joined the company 3 years ago now, one of the co-founders, then one of the CEOs, asked me to put together a study on this very specific thing. So, just like I would have done in my previous jobs, I sent an email to 20 different people. I laid out a specific, question, goal, next step, suggested a call time where we could all come together in a stand-up. Nobody responded to me, not a single person. And it wasn't until a day later that a member of the team who later became one of my direct reports said, "Oh, Annie, nobody saw that because we don't email at Atlassian." And that is, and we also don't have a strong meeting culture. We would set this up in a page for people to review asynchronously by a clear deadline. And, those are the reminders that, when you come to Atlassian and when you come to this opportunity of working differently, you have to be skeptical of your toolkit and be willing to do things differently and to be comfortable knowing that you're going to send an email for an urgent, task for the CEO, and it's going to fall through because you haven't figured out the new way of working yet. And that actually led me to build the research team that I did, because I realized if we're going to succeed in this way, we have to study what's happening and make some hypotheses about what good looks like.
And you set that up perfectly, Annie, because that was my next question. I'd love to drill down on the team of behavioural scientists. A lot of the guests that we have on are people analytics leaders or professionals, and I know a lot of our listeners are working in people analytics. And certainly when we've researched leading people analytics teams, and when we mean leading teams, we mean those that tell us that they're consistently adding value and having an impact. One of the key roles that they invest in to develop and retain is behavioural scientists. And obviously you have a team of this. Can you tell us a little bit more about this team, why it was established, what its mission is, maybe a couple of examples of some of the work that they've done?
Yes. So the Teamwork Lab is led by a brilliant behavioral scientist named Molly Sands. And Molly has also a background in product management, which is great. It makes her perfectly suited to navigate a complex tech organization and figure out how to add value in our product roadmaps and the way that we tell our story in our sales and marketing channels. And so that gave us the opportunity to add to the team. I think it's a group of about 10 folks, and we do a variety of different things. On the one hand, we have our kind of experiment funnel where we're constantly testing new ways of working on Atlassians, using our products as some of the root of what we're focusing on. And we also do external research like the State of Teams report that I just mentioned, where we're trying to understand, hey, we built some hypotheses about what we are experiencing internally. And then this gives us an opportunity to go and get the macro story out in the world to say, is everyone struggling with these things in the same way that we expect they are? And then we do discrete research or analytics projects where we're looking at a specific issue and we want to understand, how location impacts performance, or we do a lot of work with the team to actually understand the efficacy of our offices, which has been incredibly valuable to us because we really take the hypothesis that, or the ethos that our offices are a product and require the same level of research as any other product would. What we're really doing in the Teamwork Lab is we're understanding what modern teamwork looks like, and we're trying to build consensus over what the best behaviors really are. And that's a challenge. I think we're hesitant to, I think all companies, are kind of hesitant to say, here's the best way of doing things. But there are some really clear things that we've learned that I think are applicable to all companies and teams, regardless of, which tool they use to implement them, or what size they are, or, what they're trying to achieve.
And in terms of the outputs, the outcomes, the insights that this team is bringing to the organization, how has that influenced ways of working at Atlassian?
I think first of all, I'll say that it's not that we have a perfectly a perfect way of working at Atlassian. I think if you came to Atlassian tomorrow, you would feel that it was a really different and more modern way of working than most organizations. You would feel that right away. And there are some norms that are quite fully adopted, and others that, we're offering over time, where people experiment with them, they try them, and they become adopted in some pockets, and in some pockets they don't. I would say we are able to use the research that we have not just to influence internal ways of working, but we also help our sales team, for instance, understand the power of working in modern ways. And we help our marketing team tell the story of the customer problems that people are facing out there in the world in terms of ways of working. And that really gives this research team a strong platform to continue to invest in the research, which again, that's David going back to, there's always the thing that we're building, and then there's the transformation that we're driving. And when we think about the transformation that we're driving, I always want to make sure that whatever our team is doing is first and foremost continuing us on our vision to become a distributed company. However, it also needs to happen in the context of what our business is trying to achieve, because you can't transform unless you're in the channels of business change. And so, making sure that the research team is serving our business in those key ways is an important way to keep the lights on, so to speak, to make sure that we continue to have the opportunity to do this work.
And two things. Firstly, for listeners, we'll put a link to the State of Teams research report in the show notes.
It's really cool.
And then secondly, how closely or not does your team work with the people analytics, your people analytics colleagues at Atlassian?
Quite closely. We have a new people analytics leader who I know knows many of the folks in your world, David, Emma Crockett, who formerly worked at Meta, and I was a colleague there as well. And she is, rebuilding the people analytics team, having only joined about 6 months ago. And it's been such an incredible partnership to really build distributed norms into our stable org analytics. So one challenge that I see people analytics teams make people analytics teams have when I speak to folks out in the field is that we haven't integrated the norms of distributed work into the way that we report our people data. Using, for instance, this is a small example, but when we are looking at office attendance, we want to understand where people are coming from. Because if you're coming from 2 hours away, it's very different than if you're coming from 30 minutes away. I want to understand, are the whole group of people who live within 30 minutes coming in frequently? Because that would indicate it's easy for them and I'm setting up a great service for them, so they're going to keep using it. Whereas if people are coming from outside a commutable distance, I know that they're visiting from out of town. So I need to have a different level of service provided to them. Location and office attendance have never been a thing that was really a concern in the past.
No, that should be about outcomes, really, shouldn't it? But anyway, you mentioned that even though you have a distributed work model and people don't have to come into the office, people do.
Right.
Have you had any insights about that, or is it down to the culture? Is it just the way that how you organise work at Atlassian? Love to hear a bit more about that.
Well, I think it has to do with how people feel about the office. People want to go in the office, especially now. I've never heard more of my friends say, I've got to get out of my house and I've got to get into the office. And you'll notice today, I'm actually working from a co-working space that's located across the street from my apartment, which is something I invest in personally. But I just needed to get out of my home space, but I still needed someone really close by, which I'm fortunate to do. And sometimes I'm in our New York City office, which is about 45 minutes from me. And I think that people come to the office because we've designed the office in a way that serves them. We're focused on making it a hospitality-led and event-driven experience. And we continually redesign the office to make sure it supports how work happens in this moment. I would say a lot of offices continue to have conference rooms for 4 people that are never used, and the individual spaces are way overutilized. So we've started to build toward a reality where people spend their time in many different locations in the office throughout the day. They don't want an open, noisy floor plan. They want a dedicated, quiet library space with a place to go take a call. They want individual call spaces that they can use for a couple of hours. They want a really dense, fun cafe space where they can take drop-in calls or meet up with a friend. They want high quality, healthy, by the way, huge trend towards request of healthy eating at the office over the past 3 years. We used to have a candy wall. We've gotten rid of all of that stuff and have instead replaced it with fresh fruit, which is something that we didn't offer before. So people's tastes are changing and we are meeting the moment, and people like to be around their work friends and their colleagues. So we find that our attendance, we measure sort of attendance or office health in each of our 12 offices. We're in the green in all of those offices. And, sometimes we have a kind of high tide watermark that we look at every month or so. And, there's always days of the month that are over capacity. And that's good for us because that means that we've kind of managed the right level of space to accommodate us at our busiest while keeping things buzzy when it's at its slowest.
And I think one of the key things that you said was, number one, you look after the real estate as well, so you're connecting everything
Right.
together. And I think then is you look at the office as a product.
Yes.
And products evolve, products develop, products change, depending, and you want to give a great user experience. So
Right.
you're testing all of that. And maybe that's a lesson for other organizations to kind of learn from, I guess, as well.
Well, and it's interesting because I think the reality of corporate real estate organizations is that it used to be a simple formula. You just project space growth based on headcount growth. And you assume that the office is required to get work done. So you need to make sure that there's space for every single person at your office. And for us, now we have a smaller footprint of offices, although we have grown into additional offices over the time period of the pandemic. And we do a ton of projecting about what our kind of membership is going to look like and what our members need, and that is something that we're doing through constant listening and learning through different channels. And potentially unlike a product, it does require CapEx schedules and depreciation schedules, and it can take time to make the investments to change the functionality of an office. But one of the things that we did in Sydney was something that we called Project Innovate. And we basically took 2 floors offline and then redesigned all of them, but mostly with soft furnishings, where we created different types of environments, including a really cheap studio, production content studio that was all self-service. And it has been incredibly successful to see when you have a clear hypothesis about what a space should do, and you communicate that use to the company just in its design, even just through soft furnishings and things like plants and art, then you totally change the way things are used. And so for very small relative investment, we were able to drive this huge experimentation, which was important for us because we were opening a new headquarters in Sydney in fiscal year 27. And so we wanted to have we wanted to test all of our hypotheses before we bake them into the plan in that new headquarters.
I'd love to talk a little bit more about asynchronous work. I managed to say it properly. That's good. So I know, obviously, as you said, it's a big part of Atlassian's culture. Could you explain what asynchronous work means to Atlassian and how it supports productivity and work-life balance?
Yes. So first of all, again, these words are so hard. Remote work, asynchronous work, we're saying we can't even pronounce them. It's like we're doing this synchronously and this asynchronously. We can barely get out all of the S's. But asynchronous work basically means that it's work that's not happening when you're together. So right now we're together, we're in a synchronous environment. And our premium on synchronous work should be higher than ever. We want to do the best, most valuable things that we can when we're spending time together, because now we have technology to manage a lot of the other things, which gives us the opportunity to do tasks a bit more independently or asynchronously. And when we figured out, so I guess our biggest hypothesis is that the most important thing that companies can do is spend the time they spend together in a valuable way. And that means cutting out a lot of the noise from the way we spend that time today and replacing it with technology. And to us, that comes down to a few clear new practices. The first is that teams need to be really clear on what matters. They need really good goals, and that helps them direct their time, which is their biggest asset. So one, being super clear on goals is an incredibly important part of this formula. The second is that teams need fewer, better meetings. And they need to use the meetings that they spend for a different purpose. So when I say fewer meetings, I mean, instead of finding a meeting to get up to speed on something, you ask your LLM or your AI agent to search the corporate documentation and surface for you the context that you're looking for. That's instant, instead of having to wait 3 days for a meeting to get that information. It also means to use different formats. So we have an incredible tool called Loom, which is like, a video message that's incredibly intuitive on a response basis. You can have a great asynchronous conversation with it. You can use emojis. It titles the video for you. It creates a summary. It's an incredibly intuitive tool. And if you're looking to improve just one thing about asynchronous work, go try making a Loom. But that can replace meetings, because I can just have a thought bubble that I want to go out to my leadership team, and I can record it on Loom, and all 6 of us on the team can participate in that conversation in a non-urgent but highly productive way. So that's incredibly valuable. And then also try things like voice notes and just kind of these asynchronous methods where you don't need to call a meeting to have it. Then you think about what it means to have a better meeting. So any meeting that you're having to report status updates is something that you can assign to your AI. Don't have meetings unless you're doing work together or driving momentum or solving a big problem. And so I would say I actually spend a lot of time in meetings every day, but they're all working meetings. They're not talking about getting context on something or assigning the project plan. I do that all in Jira. I manage that in our goals platform. I look at project status updates in our goals platform, which provides a tweet size update in every single project in the company. And I can see every project in the company that I have permission to see from a permission standpoint. So the internet does that for us, right? But when I'm in a meeting with my team or a cross-functional partner or whomever it might be, we're leaving that meeting solving a problem, and we're spending our time together creating something as opposed to just, I guess, reflecting on something. And the one way that we drive effectiveness in those meetings, because one important use of meetings can also be to make decisions, although I would say that we probably make a higher degree of asynchronous decisions at Atlassian because our documentation is so good. We have something called page-led meetings. So we have a tool called Confluence, which is a documentation tool. It's incredibly intuitive, and you can put any kind of media into it, and it's very visually easy to navigate. And people create sort of 3 to 4 minute read time pages that are extremely effective at communicating what the reader needs to know. And when you join a meeting, you spend that 3 to 4 minutes reading the page. Now everyone's up to speed. Anyone who isn't in the meeting who might want this information can get up to speed in 3 to 4 minutes. And you have the balance of the time to talk and figure things out, as opposed to verbally presenting information, which would take 17 minutes to present that 3 to 4 minute read time. So it's a way better use of time, and it forces the person who's leading the meeting to make it very, very valuable. And so, I said there's a couple of things. There's goals, there's fewer, better meetings. That leads me to the third thing, which is you got to communicate differently, and you need to be able to use writing extremely effectively. Smart brevity is my favorite tool for this. This is a framework that was developed by Jim Vandehey, who is a founder of Axios. And it's just about how to create a super scannable, easy to read message that just says, TLDR, here's what's important, here's why it matters, and here's a few more details. This is incredibly effective at sharing information around your organization. I always talk about this example where somebody was trying to communicate to me an extremely detailed regulatory issue related to real estate that was going to that caused real risk. So I needed to send it up to the CEO. I originally got, a lengthy email, and the process of me converting this, email into this, set of bullets that could be instantly and intuitively understood by a CEO took me 48 minutes. And so by having my team start with the format of smart brevity, it might take me 8 minutes. It might take me one or two back or forths to make sure that the argument or the information or context is fully there. But it's not the exercise of taking raw information, finding the argument, and delivering it up the chain. One of the things that I like to say on my team is when we communicate, we don't pass on leadership debt. We figure out what needs to be communicated and we deliver that communication. And that's very different than just kind of writing what you think, right? So that's an essential async tool. And then the last major skill I would say is that information has to be available within the digital ecosystem so AI can access it. That means every goal, every project, all of your strategy documentation, your deliverables, what your org looks like. And all of that information needs to be instantly retrievable by anyone on the team that should have access to it. And AI helps that happen. So that makes an organization move way, way faster, because today people play telephone instead of using technology. They get on into a meeting and it's incredibly ineffective. So the future is information online, searchable by AI.
And we're going to get onto the AI piece in a minute, actually, because I know you've been doing some research on AI collaboration. I think what really comes out from what you've just said there, Annie, is, digital and data literacy is such an important skill. We cannot underestimate how important that is in the world of work today. And again, what you've just talked about there is working differently. So how we work is different, but it can be more effective.
Right.
And so those skills underpinning those always that digital and data literacy, and certainly data literacy is a skill we see missing in a lot of HR professionals at the moment. To be a bit more comfortable with data, interpreting information, as you said, summarizing. That whole process of doing that helps you to understand it anyway.
Totally.
So really, really interesting. AI, I think, is, part of working differently is AI. You've talked about, doing things digitally means that we can take advantage of AI, and presumably one of those things that AI helps us to do is take away some of those boring, repetitive tasks and helps us do stuff that's frankly more interesting and more impactful as well.
Right.
More interesting. So you've recently released some research on AI collaboration. One point that really stood out was how AI power users can typically save up to 7 hours a week by effectively integrating AI into their workflows. Now, if you work a 35-hour week, which, okay, most people don't, even if you work a 42-hour week, that's still nearly 20%. That's a big saving. How is Atlassian fostering this kind of advanced AI adoption within its own workforce?
So interesting how fast this is moving, because when we took on AI and worked towards releasing Rovo, which we released for general availability back in October and announced the previous April. And Rovo is, it's a set of agents that we can create for any purpose. It's also a enterprise level AI driven search that can look across all of our enterprise surface areas. And there are many other applications as well. And when we were first talking about it, not being on the AI team myself, I'm sure that they may have had a different view, but I was like, this is going to take so long to figure out. This still feels pretty conceptual. And then it got released And then I started using the ChatGPT app, and I was like, anyone who is not using this is already behind. And I am learning at such a rate that I can't believe how much faster I'm moving. And in part, Molly had told me, and Ben Ostrowski, who is leading some of this AI research, Molly Sands being our, head of our teamwork lab, that one of the big insights was that there's a mindset shift that's required, where you need to think of AI as a co-creator as opposed to a delegate or a delegate. And I didn't understand that at the time, but what it's meant for me is that I think that we need to start crossing the chasm on AI using consumer use cases. So once I downloaded the ChatGPT app, which I use only for personal reasons and I don't use for corporate reasons, I just have an endless set of conversations with it. Like today, I was going to talk to ChatGPT and I pulled up my text app because in my mind, it's now graduated to a friend that I'm texting as opposed to a tool that I'm using. And I do everything from, I have celiac disease and I've been kind of figuring out how to heal from that. And so one of the things that I've been doing is I ask ChatGPT every single day if my what I'm planning to eat for lunch or dinner or breakfast is a good thing, and it will give me all of these tweaks and recommendations and new recipes. Or I will ask ChatGPT what to do with my kids on a Saturday, or I will, think about a challenging personal conversation that I need to have and ask it to make me an outline. I'm super, for anyone, I know there's plenty of nerds on this in this viewership. So for anyone interested in a great book, I just read Notes on Complexity by Neil Thies over the holiday break. Incredible synthesis of the three pillars of science, and complexity theory being a way that the universe self-organizes in all different kind of formulations and sizes. And there's the final part of that book talks about different spiritual realities and how these things intersect with these sort of the limitations of empirical science. ChatGPT and I can have so many conversations about this stuff. It is just so fun. So again, these consumer applications help you realize that it's not just about writing an email better or doing something you don't want to do. It's about getting incredibly value additive information. I can't even tell you how informative it's been about my health. I just got off a call with my nutritionist and she was like, oh, you should try this thing and this thing. I was like, yeah, ChatGPT already did that. It already told me to do that. So, it's like, I don't want to say it replaces her expertise because it doesn't, but it just helps get me so much more informed. Then we think about what you can do in the corporate setting. And in the corporate setting, where obviously there's a lot more guardrails and privacy, and you would only ever use your enterprise setting for any work information that you're trying to deal with, but you can just move so much faster. You don't need to ever ask somebody to send you a document again. You can just ask, in plain English, hey, can you find that document that Miriam and I were working on last week? And up it will pop with a summary. One of the great tools that I've used it for is I will kind of say, hey, I have this thing that I'm trying to do with this team. And, I think here is the outcome and here are the different places, surface areas that we're playing in. Can you turn this into a goal? It would have taken me 3 hours to come up with a goal as succinct as AI can give us. So play with it as a consumer and see how fast it makes you move as a leader. Because, I talk to people who are unwilling for whatever reason to engage with AI. And I'm just like, it's so easy and it's so transformative. Now is the time to experiment.
Well, as you said, just experiment, just try, just see how you get on.
Right. And before you know it, you'll be thinking it's a friend in your text inbox.
Replace my dog, but never replace my dog. And what kind of practice have been most transformative for helping teams seamlessly integrate AI into their workflows? Especially maybe from a distributed work perspective.
Well, I have to give all credit to our technical teams, and our engineering teams who have been very thoughtful about integrating AI opportunities into especially our internal tools. So we have this incredible tool that manages our performance management process called Elevate. And that even this, we'd go through that process every 6 months, and new this 6 months in this half has been new AI features that give us the opportunity to really use AI in a meaningful way, with while also being thoughtful and ethical about how performance reviews and AI come together. And so again, I think that type of exposure and helping people learn from it has been a really embedded part of what we're doing. Also, Atlassian is an incredibly business focused culture. And so, again, all credit to our executive leadership team and to our founders and CEO, who are constantly talking about AI and are just genuinely excited about AI. And that excitement and priority rubs off on everyone. I would say the next generation of practices is the development of agents. So it's incredibly easy to develop an agent through Rovo, our AI tool. You literally just open up a screen and say, I'm building an agent on new hire onboarding. And here is the folder of information that I want you to be an expert on. And make sure, on a scale of 10, make sure that your niceness is a 7, professional, but not overwhelmingly friendly. And, set those parameters, and instantly you have an agent that can do what you're looking for it to do. And I think that is going to be profoundly transformative, especially as we think about HR organizations, where a lot of this, one-to-one help is really needed and can be at least initially facilitated through an agent.
Got a couple of questions left, Annie. Now, I'm sure anyone listening to this is convinced, okay, distributed work,
I hope.
moving everything digital. But a lot of times, sometimes the people listening have to convince senior leaders within their organization. I'm not going to get into all the politics of stuff, but it's almost like the where we work question has become heavily politicized, certainly in the US, but not just in the US, to be fair at the moment. We've seen high-profile examples of CEOs and companies bringing back employees 5 days a week, again, focusing on the where and not on the how again. What guidance would you offer to HR, people analytics leaders, maybe teams a little bit like the Teamwork Lab at Atlassian, if there are any out there, on how they can evaluate and, depending on the data, defend flexible working, distributed work?
I think when we think about distributed work, or the opportunity to have some choice in where a person works from, there is starting to be a fairly good consensus from the industry on industry-wide research. So I'm thinking specifically of Nick Bloom and Raj Chowdhury over at Harvard. And I think the success buckets that you want to investigate are we hiring people faster? Are we retaining them longer? Do we have less churn? Is the quality of hire at least as good or better? I think one thing that's not discussed as frequently, but I think is relevant, is can you attain that same talent at a cheaper rate? Certainly hiring, for instance, in San Diego versus San Francisco has the same collaboration impact, but can be a different compensation zone. And I think that's a nice incentive for business. And then, so I think you want to look across those metrics. And, again, the industry research is showing that having the opportunity to choose where you work just a couple days a week, or just sometimes, drastically reduces quit rates. And by giving people heavy-handed in-office mandates, the best talent leaves. At Atlassian, I can say that the number one reason why top performers say they want to stay at Atlassian is because of Team Anywhere. And that's a great thing for companies. I mean, I think it's non-controversial that having great people is what makes a company successful. And then I think you want to look at, what performance looks like. So I would say that the number one thing hampering performance for companies right now is the ability to work differently and use the internet to its advantage and to harness AI. So anybody who is considering a return to office mandate, in this current round, I would say that takes a lot of time and energy. We don't really have a lot of evidence that that's going to solve our problems. How close are we to adopting AI? Because AI is going to drive collaboration, save time, increase quality, give us greater innovation. Let's start focusing on how we work versus where we work. And what happens over time is, once you start figuring out how to work differently, it just doesn't matter where work happens as much. The office will still be an important part of the overall picture. People want to come together. And I think that's a big misnomer here that, the idea of distributed work is that we're going to become part of this corporate video game with NPC coworkers and, everybody wearing a VR headset all the time. That's not the case. People want the office. They just want the office to deliver value for them. And they've learned something, which is that they value the opportunity to eat a healthy meal at home and be home when their kids get home and go for a run in their neighborhood in the morning instead of putting on business formal wear. And doing that sometimes is not, that's improving how they work, not taking anything away, and taking that really valuable thing from people without improving any business outcome. I think is really people really struggle to digest that, and it loses trust with your organization and causes them to leave. So I think it's just about being sensible, focusing on the outcomes, and really driving the conversation toward it's how we work, not where we work, that matters.
Yeah, and I think one of the key things you talked about there early on in that answer was, talking the language of the business. If it's senior executives, quantify it,
Yeah,
talk about it, makes it hiring a lot easier. It's actually cheaper to hire the same talent. We've got data around quit rates, and stuff like that. So we can do it, but it's going to cost us a lot more money by doing it, and
exactly.
then people might think again. And I think, yeah, right to obviously highlight Nick Bloom, Raj Chowdhury, Brian Elliott. I think, as long as along with yourself, Linda Grattan, others like that, are really producing some great research
Yeah,
about this way of working, which I think helps HR professionals that are having those conversations, with senior leaders.
yeah.
Annie, I'm conscious of time. We've got a couple of questions left. One is about upcoming research that you're doing. The next one is around the question of the series that we're asking everyone. So looking to the future, is there any upcoming research that you're particularly excited about within the Teamwork Lab?
We're really focused in this next few months on the concept of information. So, the way people are getting information today tends to be meetings. Yes, there's one-off information that's available in different places. And yes, information silos are a thing that's been around since the 1990s, right? But with AI is completely transforming how we access information. And that's going to cause us to really deliberately change our behavior to use our time better. So that's something I'm really immersed in and interested in right now.
Great. Well, we look forward to hearing more about that in future months. This is Annie. This is a question we're asking each guest on this series, and appreciate that you're in HR now. We've worked in and out of HR moving forward, but I think it's a topic that you're an expert on, the team effectiveness part. How can HR help the organisation understand and improve team effectiveness?
Great question. I think that, first of all, you can't be a credible advisor on improving the effectiveness of the team, which causes friction to drive any kind of change, unless you deeply understand the business. So I spend a lot of time staying up on what we're saying internally, where we're going, what external strategists say about where we're going, just really sitting in the middle of what each of our executive team leaders are trying to achieve and where the challenges might be in that or what blockers they might face. So I make sure that if I'm recommending something, it serves them. And then the next thing is, how do you actually impact team effectiveness? And, it's the center of what we've talked about today. How we work matters. It's the opportunity of our time. And so, let's start owning that conversation and help driving change, because we're not going to be able to solve the big problems that we're facing as companies, as teams, or in the greater world unless we can think about solving those problems differently. And I think it's time for that.
Yeah, very good. And I think you're right. I mean, be a good business leader first. Be knowledgeable about the business. If you're in HR, you're a business person who happens to work in HR.
Right.
You're not. It's not HR in the business. You are a business person. And I think that's
Exactly. I think a lot about if a CFO is allocating capital, an HR leader is allocating time. And the time and capital are the only two things we've got, right? So let's make sure that we're investing our time wisely through smart org design, through people that have the right skills, and through ways of working that make sense.
Perfect, Andy. Annie, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I've learned a lot. I think
David.
you're doing some fantastic work at Atlassian with Team Anywhere, and obviously publishing some of that externally as well. How can people stay in touch with you, learn more about Team Anywhere, learn about the work you're doing at Atlassian, and learn more about Atlassian as well?
Please come find me on LinkedIn. I post all of our research and commentary about what's evolving out in the industry. And you can check out our Teamwork Lab website, which we can make sure that folks get, David, where we post all of our different research reports.
Annie, thank you very much. Look forward to hopefully seeing you again in person.
Please.
I think we met, the first time we met was at the New York HR Analytics meetup last September.
That's right.
Hope to see you again there soon.
Yes, me too. I just saw Anna Tavis the other day.
There we are. It's a small world.
I love it.
All right, you take care, Annie.
Bye, David. Thank you.
In this series, we will be speaking to a range of senior leaders who are pushing a data-driven and digital HR agenda. Make sure that you subscribe via your podcast app of choice and also via our YouTube channel for free and regular interviews with the digital HR leaders of the future.